All right, thank you. And thank you all so much for joining. I know we gave you some mixed messages. It looks like it's being recorded, so if you're on video, you might end up in the recording. If you're comfortable with that, able, willing, it definitely helps me to see human faces respond to things I say. I definitely missed that this past year, so if you're comfortable with that, great. If not, that's okay too. So my name's Dana Flightman. I'm with the Stalking Prevention Awareness and Resource Center, or SPARC, a project of Equitas. And I'm delighted to be with you today to present our quarterly presentation of Context is Key, Recognizing and Responding to Stalking. So I've seen some folks introduce themselves in the chat, which is great, and I appreciate. Looks like we have a lot of different professionals on the call, but it'd be great just to get a little more of a sense of who was able to join live. So if you could just answer here on the poll, which of these professions you most closely identify with. And I realized I meant to have campus option and didn't. So you can go ahead and put other there if you're university higher admin staff. So give you a few seconds to do that. And of course, it's great to see people from different disciplines because we know we need a multidisciplinary approach to recognize and respond to stalking. So we absolutely need everybody. And I'll give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, end poll. Okay, I'll share the results here. So it looks like we have a lot of DVNSA program staff, some victim witness folks, batter intervention, prosecutor, law enforcement, mental health, coalition, and other. I'm assuming that includes some of our university and higher ed admin. So please feel free to continue to introduce yourselves in the chat, and thank you all so much for joining. So I do training on stalking all across the country for audiences of folks like yourselves, law enforcement, prosecutors, campuses, victim services. And typically I start by asking this question, which I'll put in the poll now. And that's, have you had the opportunity to attend a training specifically on the topic of stalking before? So not one where it was kind of thrown in there, but we are doing the stalking training. So I'll give you a few seconds to answer that. All right. Start the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay. Thanks for doing that. And so we have a few folks who've attended several trainings. A lot of people saying, yeah, I've been to 1 or 2, but almost half the group saying, hey, this is my first stalking training. And that's not a reflection on you all as professionals, but it does kind of help illustrate how under-resourced we are on this issue. And we want to remember there are 4 major crimes under the Violence Against Women Act, right? It's domestic violence, sexual assault, dating violence, and stalking, but it's always kind of and stalking. Like we almost called our website andstalking.org because so often it's an afterthought in our field and kind of seen as the less important cousin of these other crimes that we're really focused on. But the reality is that stalking is prevalent. It is something that the victims, survivors, and offenders you're working with and for are definitely experiencing. And we want to be able to identify those stalking cases and help those victims and survivors to hold those offenders accountable and keep those victims safe. And so often our stalking cases do not go identified and these offenders are not held accountable. So I really appreciate you joining me today to help enhance your ability to do that work that you're already doing through that lens of stalking, because you're out there, you're the ones on the ground really doing the work. My goal is really just that you move that and stalking a little bit more to the beginning of the sentence and see that critical work you're already doing through that lens. So SPARC is funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. We are the technical assistance provider on stalking. And so our website is stalkingawareness.org. We did not go with andstalking.org. So on there, we have a lot of resources, including practitioner guides. Those are broken out by discipline. So we have for victim services, for law enforcement, for probation, for prosecutors. And we're developing a new campus-specific section that should be up soon. We have training modules, so if you do any kind of community awareness education, public awareness, we have programs that are scripted with videos, we have discussion guides for the show you, and other materials you can pick up and just lead without having to reinvent the wheel. We are not a direct service provider, so please do not refer victims to Spark, but we do have some resources that can be helpful information for victims and survivors and just the general public. So we have, fact sheets, infographics, and some big picture resources to help folks understand stalking, and webinars like this one. So if at the end of this, you're like, man, I wish I could hear Dana talk even more, you are in luck because we have an archive of past webinars. I'll probably reference a couple of them today for deeper learning on a few topics. You can also request future training on our website, and we're on social media. Please do follow us. Our handle on there is @followuslegally if you get our sick sense of humor at Spark. If not, it'll be a long hour for you. So your call either way, but please do follow us. We're on Instagram, Facebook, and Twitter, and LinkedIn. Also, we will not sign you up for our newsletter automatically because as an anti-stalking organization, we are not going to contact you without your consent. So you have to actually sign up for it. You can do that on our website. We only send emails about quarterly. Okay, so why learn about stalking besides, okay, this webinar was offered, it's one of the 4 crimes. Well, stalking is a really important thing to understand. It is criminal, it is traumatic, and it is dangerous. So stalking is criminal. It's a crime at the federal level in all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and US territories. It's a crime on tribal lands and in the military justice system. It might be a misdemeanor or a felony, might be a different class of crime, depending on the jurisdiction and the situation, but it is a crime across the board. A lot of folks don't realize that stalking is a crime. And so you have victims saying, well, what, should I call the police because somebody rang my doorbell or keeps driving by my house? Because those acts on their own aren't criminal, but they can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. So we know that a lot goes into a victim's decision to engage with the criminal justice system or not, but a lot of them don't even realize what's going on is a crime, that they have the right to access that system in response to it. So it's criminal and it's traumatic. So quite often when folks talk about stalking, if they do, they go right to that co-occurrence with physical violence and lethality. And that is very important. I'll talk about it in just a couple slides, but I want to point out that even if the stalking in no way intersects with physical violence and lethality, it's still a crime in its own right because it is deeply traumatic for victims and survivors. So many stalking victims experience mental health issues that can be lifelong, particularly post-traumatic stress disorder, depression, and anxiety. If you think about that anticipatory fear, that waiting for the other shoe to drop, that I never know what'll happen next. And maybe you've had a situation like that where you're waiting for like an important call from the hospital or an important email from a potential employer, and you're in that kind of heightened state where any moment something could happen. We have stalking victims who feel like that sometimes for years. And so you can imagine the kind of toll that that would take over time. Many lose time from work. 1 in 8 lose some time from work. About half of those lose 5 days or more. And stalking victims are typically not a protected class of worker. So in other words, if they go to their employer and say, hey, here's what's going on, could I switch shifts or could I, not answer the front desk phone? The employer can be accommodating and great, or they can say that's an inconvenience to the company, you're fired. And typically they can do that and that victim will not have any recourse. So we do see stalking survivors losing their employment, both because of that lack of accommodation and because of the interference from the stalker, right? They slash my tires, I can't get to work. They're parked outside my office window, I don't feel safe going in. I have to go to court, I can't make this meeting. So for all those reasons, we see that impact to employment, and quite a few relocate. So this really shocked me when I learned this, that 1 in 7 stalking victims move. So think about how annoying it is to move when you want to move, right? Even if you're excited about moving, still to pack up your things and get your family ready, it's expensive, it's stressful. It's not something you do lightly. We have 1 in 7 stalking victims relocating to get away from these offenders. So I think it shows how consuming this is. It's always good to hear from survivors in their own words. Here's a survivor who said, it's not easy to describe the fear you have when you see the stalker or signs of the stalker everywhere you go. I have given up all hopes of ever having a safe life. For the rest of my life, I will be looking over my shoulder, expecting to see him there. And I like this quote because it illustrates what so many stalking survivors have expressed to me, the sense that it's never really over, that I knew the day probation ended, they'd call me, and they did, that it's never done, they can always come back, and how stressful and traumatic that is. And stalking is dangerous. It often co-occurs with physical assault and sexual violence, including rape. 1 in 5 stalkers use weapons, either to threaten or to directly harm their victims. And in 76% of intimate partner femicide, so that's murder of a female partner by a male partner, in 76% of completed and 85% of attempted, there was stalking the year prior to that murder or attempted murder. And yet so often these early signs are dismissed as, oh, it's just texting, it's sending weird gifts, it's following, no one's really getting hurt here. And that's simply not true. In fact, this one wonderful researcher we work with, Patrick Brady, went so far as to say that stalking is homicide in slow motion. It is these different behaviors and incidents adding up and escalating over time, not always right in a straight line, right? There might be periods of dormancy. There might be periods where it seems like it's changing or making a lateral move, but escalating over time. Now, I'm not saying every stalking case rises to the level of physical violence or homicide. That's not accurate. What I am saying is that every week I read cases about intimate partner homicide or extreme violence or attempted violence or homicide. And only at this point are folks looking backwards and saying, oh, there's this whole history of stalking leading up to this. We don't want to do that, right? We shouldn't have to wait for this violent or attempted violent incident to look backwards. We want to identify that stalking behavior early, intervene, and look forwards, because stalking gives us that opportunity. It's one of the few crimes where early identification and intervention can help prevent trauma, violence, and possibly even death. And yet it's really underreported. So similar to sexual violence and intimate partner violence, we know that most victims are not reporting to law enforcement. So why not? Well, the reasons are also quite similar to those reasons that folks don't report for domestic and sexual violence, right? This sense of it's personal, it's embarrassing. I think with stalking, we see a lot of minimization. So this, I don't want to make it a big deal. Is it serious enough to report? Not recognizing that it's a crime that even could be reported, right? No one's been hurt yet. I can't prove it. I don't have the evidence. We have that fear of escalation, which of course is very valid. We know that the risk goes up to a victim when they involve an authority figure, right? When a protective order serves, that escalates risk to the victim. And so absolutely we see that, and a variety of other reasons. They may not trust law enforcement. They may have had a negative experience previously, or have a friend who has, or be from a community who has, so there's a variety of reasons why folks don't report. And I think the ones not unique, but maybe especially, relevant in our stalking cases are that not knowing it's a crime, that minimization is really big. But let's say, and that lack of evidence, feeling like I can't prove it. So, what's the point of even bringing it up? But let's say they do report it. So this was a study in the state of Colorado, about 1,800 cases of domestic violence. About 300 involve clear, documented evidence of stalking. So that's hard to get, right? Sometimes we don't have that. We don't have that evidence. We don't have these reports. But here we have police files, domestic violence cases, 298 involve clear, documented evidence of stalking. How many of these cases do you think were charged as stalking? Like got a stalking charge? It was 1. Only 1 case was actually charged as stalking. And look, a lot goes into charging decisions. I understand that. But at the end of the day, we need to recognize that these offenders are not being held accountable. And this crime is not being identified, both from our law enforcement and from our victim services side. But it's okay, we're going to fix it today. So today I'm going to talk about what is stalking, talk about some of the most common stalking behaviors, briefly about the intersection with intimate partner violence and sexual violence, and then I'll give you a few big picture strategies for responding to victims. I've seen some folks ask already, will there be time for questions? I'll stick around at the end, so if folks have questions there, and I'll give you my contact information too. A couple folks also asked, are the slides available? Yes, you can get a PDF of the slides, and we'll post a recording of this on our website. So what is stalking? I'm saying it's so bad, we have to do something. What is it? Well, there's the behavioral definition and our legal definitions. Every state has a different stalking statute. And so I'm happy to talk statute with you. It's important to know your state statute. Some of them are very close to that behavioral definition. Some of them are much more narrow and different. And so you definitely want to know that. We're going to focus on the behavioral definition because this is what tells us what stalking really is and what stalking really looks like. So I have these 3 scenarios for you, and I'll bring them up as polls. And each of these scenarios is a bummer, right? We don't like any of these behaviors. They're all bad. But which of them are stalking? It could be all of them, some of them, or none of them. So I'm going to launch this first one here. So I'm making you choose yes or no. I'm very mean. Okay, so this one, a student peeks in the women's locker room to watch the women undress. Does that sound like it could be stalking? Okay, so I'm going to give you a few more seconds. I know you don't get to see the votes when they're coming in, but I do, and it's pretty neck and neck right now. All right, give you 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, really right down the middle here. Most folks saying no, that's not stalking, but really about half and half. Is that stalking, yes or no? Okay, great. How about this next one? Oops, sorry about that. This ex-partner spreads vicious rumors about their former partner on social media. They're doing this repeatedly. Does this sound like stalking to you? Again, we don't like it. We don't like any of these, but are they stalking? All right, I'll give you a few more seconds. This is also coming in pretty even. All right, I'm going to give you the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Wow, talk about pretty even. We got a 50-50 right here in terms of is this stalking. Okay, and then last one. I know some people are saying, I need more information on this, but I'm being very mean, and I'm just making you answer based on this. Okay, this terrible supervisor regularly asks her employee personal questions, mocks him in meetings, is verbally abusive when he doesn't respond right away after emailing him at weird hours. Does this sound like stalking? Yes or no? All right, last one, still coming in pretty even. Interesting. All right, I'll give you the countdown. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And yeah, again, split right down the middle here. All right, well, thanks so much for doing that. And of course, you know, it's great when we're in person and you can really talk about it more. But my guess is that a few different things came up for you when you were thinking about this even on your own. And some folks even put that in the chat, right? Like, what's the bigger context around this? Is it repeated or is it just one time? Is someone being singled out or is it whoever happens to be there? So luckily for you, I will go through the behavioral definition and use these scenarios in there. So all your questions will be answered. So behaviorally, stalking is a pattern of behavior directed at a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for the person's safety or the safety of others, or suffer substantial emotional distress. So it's a pattern of behavior. It's not a single incident or one-off event, and that's called a course of conduct in most stalking statutes. So you might hear me use those terms interchangeably today, pattern of behavior, course of conduct. What I'm talking about is 2 or more behaviors that make up that pattern. Some state statutes have 3 or more, but most are 2 or more, and behaviorally 2 or more. And these behaviors can be quite varied. So let's say I'm stalking Mary Kate because I'm the worst presenter ever, okay, at SCJ, FCJ, and maybe Monday I send her a bunch of text messages. Tuesday I'm mad she didn't respond, so I smash her headlights. And then Wednesday I feel guilty about that, so I send her flowers. All of those are stalking behaviors. And so a lot of stalkers combine behaviors that are crimes on their own, like that property damage, with other behaviors that are not crimes on their own, but can become criminal in the context of a stalking case. It's not illegal to send someone gifts, right? It's not illegal to text somebody. And so it can be quite confusing because as a system, we tend to be very incident-based. There's, especially when we're looking at something like property damage, which is a part of a lot of stalking cases. It's tangible, we can see it, we get it, it goes under property crimes. And from the victim services end, we might think, okay, great, how do we protect your car? You know, let's think about that. And all of that's great, but we also need to take a step back and see what else is going on here. Because that victim may or may not think to also disclose, and the same person has been sending me weird emails, and they've been showing up, and you know, they may or may not think that's relevant. And so often these cases get missed as a single incident instead of the pattern of behavior that they actually are. So in that first scenario where someone peeks in the women's locker room, that might still be a crime if that's all they did. And of course, I don't say that to minimize it, but if it's a single incident, that's not really stalking. Now it could totally become stalking. Let's say they then, you know, find one of the women who was in the locker room and then contact her on social media. Okay, now we're looking at this voyeurism and this contact. Now we have two or more. That could be a stalking case, absolutely. But just the act on its own probably wouldn't be. Also because it needs to be directed at a specific person. So if that person is looking at whoever happens to be in the women's locker room, again, that might still be a crime, but that's more of a peeping Tom situation. It's not targeting a specific person. As again, if they then contacted that person after or took photos of them, etc., it could absolutely be part of the course of conduct. That being said, we often see what we call target dispersion, which is maybe a stalker is targeting, say, their ex-partner. Okay, and so now their ex-partner starts dating someone new. Okay, so now that stalker is targeting their ex and their ex's new romantic interest. And we also know that a stalker is very likely to reach out to a victim's family, friends, colleagues, others, right? And so to try to get information about or to reach that victim. So a lot of folks can be involved and even considered co-victimized in a stalking case, but we still see that as directed at a specific person because that offender is trying to get to that victim and they might use other people to do it, but that is really their target and they're specific. And it would cause a reasonable person to feel fear for their safety or the safety of others or suffer substantial emotional distress. And so fear is really important to understanding stalking. And when we look at emotional distress, we're talking about that emotional safety. And emotional distress doesn't mean kind of annoyed or frustrated. It means a level of distress that is severe and reasonable, right? And so in terms of that fear, it's actually what separates stalking from a crime it's often confused with, which is harassment. So harassment is typically that repeated behavior that would make someone feel angry, annoyed, belittled, frustrated, would create a hostile environment. And harassment can be quite serious. I'm not trying to minimize it in any way, but it's not necessarily scary. So if my supervisor is emailing me at 3 in the morning and then yelling at me, calling me names at the staff meeting at 9, like she's terrible and I am being harassed and it's not okay and I hate her. I'm not necessarily afraid of her. I'm just like, she's the worst. But let's say that I'm driving home. I'm pretty sure I see her car a couple back. She texts me a photo of myself walking my dog and says, why are you doing that instead of working? She emails my partner. I don't know how she got his number or his email. Okay, now I'm scared, all right? Because this person seems very fixated on me. They're escalating. They're following me in multiple places. It's really out of control. Is this person want to hurt me? Like, what's their end game here, right? And so harassment can be part of a stalking course of conduct or become stalking, but they're a little bit distinct. And it's not just a semantic difference. It's important because there's a different risk profile. So stalking typically has a higher risk profile than harassment. Also, they're separate charges and from that criminal justice piece, and typically stalking is a higher charge than harassment. If you're on campus, harassment doesn't always bring in the same Title IX considerations that stalking does as well. And so there are reasons to make that differentiation. And like I said, probably, well, I don't want to rank their importance, but an important one is certainly about that victim risk level, right? In identifying that victim risk. But that's tough, right? Because fear is very personal. Like what's scary to me and distressing to me may not be scary to you, and vice versa, right? So we're going to watch, this is literally a 5-second video. I want you to think about which of these folks you identify with more. Yep, that's it. So Some of you may have felt more in line with the woman in this video, in which case, I'm sorry I did this to you. Someone the other day was like, where was the trigger warning? So I'm sorry if you hate spiders that I did that to you. My guess is a lot of you, my hardened criminal justice and victim advocates, you've seen it all. You might be resonating more with this face left here on the screen, right? This like, can you calm down, lady? It's this tiny spider. And we can absolutely understand why this man feels this way, right? But let's back up. What if I told you that last year this woman had been bitten by a spider that looked just like that? She had a terrible allergic reaction, went to the hospital, and almost died. Would we still be making this face at her? Hopefully not, right? Because what did I give you there? Context, the backstory, more information. And it changes how we see the present situation. And that's critical. Context is critical in stalking cases. It's really everything in stalking cases, because a lot of times what's the most scary and or distressing to a victim may seem benign or even nice to an outsider who doesn't know the whole story. So for example, this was a case this woman called the police. She was hysterical. And all she'd say was, there's a cup of coffee in my car. So understandably, the police are not sending out the SWAT team. They're kind of like, you prefer tea? Like, what is your problem? You know? And eventually she calmed down enough and said, he's here. So it turned out there's a stalking survivor who had relocated to get away from that offender, address confidentiality, new job, really thought she'd covered her tracks. She leaves to go to work that day. She gets in her car. There's a cup of coffee with his old nickname for her on it. So when you know the whole story, it's very scary. But if all you see is this artifact of there's coffee in the car, it's like, I wish my car came with coffee. This is amazing, right? We have no idea what is so scary. And while I can only see a few folks on camera, typically when I tell the story in person, people go like, or like, And what that tells me is a reasonable person would feel fear. But if we don't know the story, we just don't get it, right? And so again, something may be frightening to the victim, but not to you as the responder. So what you need to do is ask them, what about that was scary to you? What about that was distressing to you? What message did that send to you? Has the person done this before? What did it mean? What's the message behind this, right? Because those behaviors often have specific meanings only understood between the victim and the offender. The classic example is an offender saying something like, I'll send you roses the day I kill you. Right, so the victim receives roses, is terrified. Everyone around the victim is saying, oh, how lovely, because they don't know that specific meaning. And again, it's the context that makes stalking criminal, and it's the stalking that makes stalking stalking. And it's really what makes it scary. And that stalking context of everything else going on and how these behaviors are adding up and relating to each other are what criminalizes those otherwise non-criminal behaviors. The truth is there's no better risk assessment than a victim's own fear. In other words, if a victim is afraid or distressed, even if it doesn't really make sense to you at first, there is probably a good reason. Sorry, so I'm going to go back to that. So we're going to watch the next few seconds of this video and see how this plays out. All right, so we don't want to be this guy, right? And this is what happens in stalking cases all the time. You have a victim who's very distressed, and we have a responder who's saying, it's a few text messages, it's no big deal. You know, they're going to knock it off, you're overreacting, calm down, when actually who here was on point? It was definitely her, right? She had the appropriate reaction for what's going on. But is it fear? So in the video, this woman's obviously afraid, she's literally screaming. But when most victims come to you, they're not going to use the word stalking or fear, right? They're not going to say, hey, I'm experiencing a course of conduct directed at me, a specific person that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or emotional distress. I believe you call that stalking, right? If they do, please call me. I'll be like, our awareness month is so good. They're probably not going to say that. They're going to say something like, my ex is being creepy, my neighbor's being weird, an old friend is making things awkward, I'm being harassed. And they probably won't use the word fear either. And that's for a few reasons. One is that as a society, we don't necessarily love to, come right out and say when we're afraid. We're more likely to mask that under something like, I'm concerned, I'm frustrated, I'm annoyed, I'm confused. And of course, we know that victims respond to trauma differently, right? So you might, of course, have victims who are just very angry, who have no affect at all, who are sad, who are laughing about the whole thing. It doesn't mean that it's not fear and that it's not stalking. We need to do that digging to understand what's really going on here. We also see quite a bit of minimization. And so, for example, I remember this law enforcement officer shared a story with me. They were the regular point of contact for a stalking victim, and the victim called them and was in a great mood. And the victim said, "Today's going to be a good day. He's only driven by my house 10 times. And the officer's like, "What do you mean today's a good day? It's 9 in the morning. That's ridiculous." And the victim said, "Oh, but usually by this point, he's driven by like 25 times. So I think today is going to be kind of low key." So it's not that that stalking victim's unreasonable, right? But she is responding to this repeated trauma by normalizing and minimizing what to most of us would actually be quite scary and alarming. And so you can hear my dog's alarmed by it, and he's been quiet up till now, so you can tell how alarming this is. And so, quite alarming, really. And so this happens all the time where they've normalized it, right? And so that's where the reasonable person standard actually is helpful behaviorally, because you can think, if I told a group of people of this, would they be like, okay, that's a reasonable person would feel fear, right? So when you think about someone else in the situation, would they be afraid? Yes, no, maybe. That can be really helpful. Another good way to assess fear and distress is to document the evidence of accommodations. And so I've definitely had victims say, "Well, I'm not afraid, but I left their picture with front desk security, and I changed my routes to and from work, and I don't go out at night anymore, just in case." Okay, well, those are things you do when someone's kind of annoying you, right? To me, that indicates a higher level of fear or distress. And so looking at some of these changes, have they increased their security or privacy measures? Have they blocked their number? Have they gotten a new security system? Did they used to go out alone and now they don't? All of those things can also help illustrate that impact. So when you're trying to parse out, okay, is this more harassment or is it more stalking? And it's a subjective line, absolutely. What is the risk level here? What's really going on with this victim? Asking some of these questions can help. So prevalence and behavior. Stalking is an extremely prevalent crime. In the United States, more than 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men experience stalking in their lifetimes. And we know that these numbers are underreported, et cetera, yet even with that, we have at least 1 in 6 women and 1 in 17 men. I'll also add that stalking impacts people of all gender identities, absolutely. This is the best available national data, and this is how it defines it, so that's why I'm repeating it to you that way. So if you think about domestic violence, that impacts around 1 in 3 or 1 in 4 women, depending what study you're looking at. Sexual assault impacts around 1 in 5 women. So stalking is really right up there in terms of the prevalence and the experience that people are having. And yet for so many folks, for stalking training, few, if any, standalone stalking resources. There's only one national organization really working on stalking, and it's a project of Equitas, and I'm a third of it. Right. And so not that we have a chip on our shoulder or anything, but, there's no stalking hotline. There's no all of these things that there are for the other crimes. And so it's just something that's really under-resourced and underserved, but we know our victims are experiencing this either as a unique victimization or as a co-victimization with those other crimes. It's more prevalent in our sexual minorities. So with our bisexual and or lesbian or gay men and women, the rates are even higher than in our general population. Women are more likely than men to experience stalking, though of course it can be experienced by, again, anyone of any gender. And the majority of victims report that the offender is male, and that's regardless of the victim's sexual orientation. So we do have women that stalk men and we have women that stalk other women, but overwhelmingly, about 80% of female victims say that their offender is male. About half of male victims say that their offender is male as well. So what's that about? Well, some of it has to do with LGBT relationships, and some of it is that target dispersion that I mentioned earlier, that an ex-boyfriend, for example, stalking an ex-girlfriend, she starts dating someone new, now he's stalking the new boyfriend as well. And so those aren't the only types of, men stalking men, but that is a great deal of it. So when I look for pictures of stalking, which I do because I'm fun, okay? This is the kind of stuff I get. So you get a lot of kind of hoodies, alleyways, strangers. It's actually very similar to that stranger rapist myth. You know, if you're familiar with that, the idea of this kind of hooded random person in the alleyway is going to pick someone and follow them and do something bad to them. And that can happen, but I'm sure it will not surprise you on the call at all to know that this is mostly not accurate, right? The vast majority of the time, actually, the victim knows the offender and the offender knows the victim. It's not these random strangers. So I don't expect you all to be surprised by that at all. But when I'm talking about stalking outside of our field, because I'm fun at parties and stuff, you know, people are shocked by this, because when most people think stalking, they think celebrities. They're thinking the Kardashians, they're thinking Taylor Swift, or they're thinking about that secret admirer stalker that you see on TV where, oh, I don't even know who it is, and I'm getting these ransom style notes or whatever. And again, that can happen, but the vast majority of the time, it's people who know each other. And this myth can really keep folks from identifying what's going on accurately, because we've had victims say, oh, that's not a stalker, that's just my ex having a hard time getting over things. Well, that's the most likely person to be the stalker, right? So about half the time overall, that stalker is a current or former intimate partner. About half the time overall, for male and female victims, a little more prevalent for female victims. And so that's a really big piece of it, is that domestic violence piece. But I also want to make the point that if about half of these cases are related to intimate partner violence, that also means about half are not, right? They're acquaintances, they may be a stranger, though it's relatively rare, a family member, or a person of authority, like a supervisor, a coach, a mentor, somebody like that. And so I encourage you to think about, in your programs, are you serving all victims of stalking, whether they're intimate partner violence related or not? Because typically our stalking response is housed under our domestic violence or rape crisis response. And that's not wrong, but it is a little bit incomplete, because if I'm being stalked by, say, an estranged friend and there was no sexual relationship, I'm probably not going to pick up the phone and call family violence services, right? Because it's not family violence. Why would that occur to me as a victim? And yet that's where the folks like you are who could actually really help me. And so we have a checklist of fun questions like that. You could ask your organization, you know, is the word stalking on our website? Do we serve all victims with stalking? If not, do we know where to refer them? You know, do we have a clear policy on if someone being stalked by someone who's not an intimate partner can come into shelter? You know, those kind of questions. So I'm actually doing a webinar next week just on non-intimate partner stalking, if you're interested in learning more about that. But just something important to consider, because again, there are few, if any, standalone stalking resources. And so it really falls to our domestic violence and sexual violence service providers and criminal justice professionals to serve all these victims of stalking. For better or worse, that's the reality of the situation. And we don't want to be missing, you know, half of our victims. So stalking behaviors can be quite varied. And I do not mean this as a compliment to stalkers, but stalkers are extremely creative criminals. Folks always tell me their most disturbing, bizarre cases are stalking cases, because if you think about it, definitionally, it is about going way out of your way just to scare and upset somebody else, right? That's the point of it. So, you know, I read a case where an offender drove 300 miles to carve his ex's name in trees near her home. Like, that's a stalking case. It's those kinds of things. And so if a victim ever says to you, I know it sounds crazy, but that should be a red flag. This might be a stalking case, because that's exactly the kind of behaviors often that offenders are engaging in. This kind of crazy making behavior where they're making the victim doubt their own reality, or doing things that are so contextual in nature that they're hard to explain to an outside party. And so they're doing that on purpose to make it harder for the victim to be taken seriously and to make that victim look like they're crazy. And so there are so many stalking behaviors, and we don't have time to list all of them, or we'd be here forever, because, like I said, unfortunately, stalkers are very creative and inventive. But I think this framework's really helpful. It's by this wonderful researcher, TK Logan, to help just kind of expand our thinking on stalking behaviors, because when a lot of folks think stalking, they think surveillance. So you get that imagery of like the binoculars and the camera. And that is a big part of a lot of stalking cases, but it's not the only thing, because anything that's scary or distressing and not the first thing that's happened could be part of a stalking case. And so that's actually quite a few different behaviors. And so this just helps, and these categories overlap and intersect, and that's fine, but it's to help sort of expand our thinking on that. So I'm going to go through each category and a few examples of each, Of course, you're the folks on the ground doing the work, so please feel free in the chat, obviously with victim confidentiality in mind, to share any examples that you've seen in your work of how stalkers have engaged in these behaviors. So surveillance is pretty much what it sounds like. How is the offender tracking, watching, monitoring, gaining information about that victim? They might be doing that in person. They might be doing that using technology. And so, you know, someone's saying cyber stalking is a big one now. Absolutely. You know, we know that there's a lot of technology used to stalk, whether that's hacking into an account, installing some stalkerware, putting a GPS on the vehicle to watch where the person goes, just watching what they do on social media, pretending to be a neutral third party to get information about them. Absolutely, we see a lot of surveillance through technology. I will say though that in most, not all, but the majority of cases, most stalkers who stalk through technology are also stalking in person. So they're doing both a lot of the time. So that asking friends and family about them, going through the mail, going through the trash, driving by the home, showing up in places they think they might be to see if they got there. And proxy stalking, which is a fancy way of saying stalking through other people. And so that can happen in person or online. And again, very, very powerful and sometimes missed. So it could be as simple as just that, hey, you know, is dad taking you on vacation soon? You know, if there's shared custody, is mom seeing anyone new? We've had cases where an offender calls someone's neighbor and says, hey, it's snowing, did they get home okay? You know, do you see their car in the driveway? Oh yeah, they made it home. And so sometimes those third parties know they're helping a stalker, and a lot of times they don't. We do, of course, have those proxies of the stalker sent very intentionally as well, right? So let's say it's, you know, your fraternity brother, you say, hey, check up on this person for me. Or someone goes to jail or prison and they have someone who's on the outside check in. So we see that stalking through other people in a variety of ways. And again, sometimes those third parties want to be involved and sometimes they have no idea they're involved. So that surveillance, that tracking, watching, getting information. Life invasion is how is the offender showing up in the victim's life where the victim does not want them to be there. So the victim's just trying to get through their day and there's the stalker or signs of the stalker no matter what they do. So we most commonly see that through that unwanted contact, right? We mostly have our cell phones on us all day. So across applications, they're texting, they're calling, including hangups, they're emailing. You go to work, your work email has stuff from them. They're on WhatsApp, they're on Snapchat, they're on Facebook. You know, they're just all these different avenues to access the person. Just showing up. So there's a lot of that, like, since when do you go to this church? You know, since when are you on the soccer team, right? But just showing up in these public spaces or private spaces. Property invasion. So this is a common one, and there's no one stalker psychology, but I do think this is important because it shows how a lot of stalkers do think, which is one common stalker tactic is to break into a victim's vehicle or residence and not take or break anything, but just leave some sign they were there. So maybe they leave a can of soda that the victim knows they always drink, or they leave the TV on a channel they used to watch together, or they move a lamp they one time argued about where it should go. And so the victim gets home, they see, let's say, that can of soda, they know that offender's been there. But they're like, what am I gonna do? Call the police and say there's a can of Diet Coke in my room? I'm gonna sound crazy. And offenders know that, and that's why they engage in these behaviors again. So it's just another reminder, of course, to believe our victims and to recognize that offenders are doing these contextual and bizarre behaviors in order to be invasive. It sends a message that I can get to you, that I got to you, but it can be hard to prove unless the victim had their own surveillance system watching the offender or some witnesses or something, right? So that property invasion, public humiliation and spreading rumors. So if you remember way back when I started talking, there were those three scenarios, and the middle one was an ex-partner repeatedly spreads vicious rumors about their ex on social media. Is that stalking, yes or no? I'd say of the three, that's the most likely to be stalking, because public humiliation, spreading rumors, kind of toes the line between that life invasion and interference, and is a really common stalker tactic. So interference is similar to life invasion, but it's how is an offender really changing what's going on in the victim's life? What is the victim losing or afraid of losing as a result of the stalker's behavior? So we think about that rumor spreading, you might be thinking, well, you know, people gossip, that's not necessarily stalking, and you'd be right. But we see some very targeted, intentional destruction of reputation. For example, there was a case where an offender was stalking his ex for so long, and anytime she got a new position, a new job, he would find out and email nude photos of her and a bunch of lies about what she liked sexually to her new employer and all her colleagues. Okay, so that's obviously beyond, oh, people gossip. That's interfering. It's invasive in a lot of ways. And also she's going through her day wondering, who's seen this? Will I be taken seriously? People think I'm involved in something weird, right? It's really, really interfering. And so we also see offenders pretend to be the victim and impersonate them on a dating website, online or elsewhere, and then spread misinformation. We see sharing intimate private photos of a victim to interfere. So all of these kinds of degrading and making the victim look like they're the one who's engaging in some weird behavior is really interfering and a very common stalking tactic. We of course see financial and work sabotage. I mean, if you think about all the accounts that you have online, and if someone who really hated you got into them, the kind of damage they could do. So we see that. We see offenders, taking out money, signing folks up for things, making weird purchases, dropping them out of things. You see keeping them from leaving, either just physically standing like outside the apartment or other ways to restrain someone. Road rage cases that are really stalking cases where someone's following someone on the road, attacking family, friends, or pets, or of course, that's actual physical or sexual attacks, as well as property damage, very tangible interference, right? They slashed my tires, I can't get to work now, I have to deal with this, that interferes with my life. We also know that targeting those close to the victim can be really scary for a victim. And so many victims say, when it was just me, it was fine. But now that they're calling my mom, my coworkers, my new partner, my friends, my roommate, now that's really not okay. So that kind of interference, as well as life invasion, that no matter what I go and who I talk to, someone's connected to the stalker and it just keeps coming back to it. And last but not least, intimidation. And hopefully you can see how all the behaviors I listed would be intimidating contextually, right? But we do see those direct threats as well. Those I will harm you, I will do this to you. Property damage or symbolic violence, like a gesture or a crushed can or something like that. Forced confrontations, like refusing to leave, standing right outside. Threats to harm oneself, we know that's really scary for a victim, as well as threats about harming others, right? And so of course we do get those direct, I will harm you, I'll do this to you, but also these more contextual threats, these implicit threats, as well as these threats to other people. And all of these can be really intimidating and part of a stalking case. And so these behaviors can intersect and overlap in disturbing and terrible ways. So for example, there is a case where an offender was engaging in surveillance. So he's watching this victim all the time, and he's also impersonating the victim online. So what he did was he made a fake profile for him on Grindr, which is a gay dating app, and he's watching. So pretending to be the victim, he's saying, hey, I'm wearing this red sweater, I'm in this coffee shop, come find me, here's what I'm into. And so then this victim's being approached by random men saying, I'm here for what we talked about. The victim's like, I'm not even on Grindr. What are you talking about? And so you see how these really enhance each other, where that surveillance, so now I know where you are, so I can send people right to you, that interference and that intimidate and that impersonation, excuse me, and then it's invasive and interfering and intimidating now, right? So now I'm ruining your reputation. I'm saying you're into all the stuff that you're not. I'm putting you out there in a public way you don't want to be. And now you're being physically approached, and you could see how that could clearly lead to sexual violence. And so I wish I could tell you that that's like a really extreme example, but the truth is through dating websites and social media, it's quite easy to make fake profiles. And so we see more and more of that happening, and these different behaviors really building on each other in different ways. So if you're trying to figure out, okay, is this stalking? Is it harassment? What's going on here? Ask about all these behaviors, because typically if you say, are you experiencing stalking? They're going to say, well, no, it's not stalking. But if you break it down and ask about all these categories, you might end up really hearing that, okay, actually, yeah, they have invaded my life. It does feel invaded because my friends are always saying they're running into this person. Oh yeah, they did put a GPS in my car that one time. They did, so it might really add up. And so make sure you ask about all these different behaviors. From a charging perspective, of course, well, from a documentation perspective, you want to document everything that stalker does. And from a charging perspective, because there's a lot of stalking behaviors, there's a lot of potential charges here as well. And so if you can charge stalking, we usually say charge stalking. But if you can't, charge something. And that's because you're helping that person down the line, even if it's a small misdemeanor or something. So if on day one you have, like, for example, So again, we do these trainings nationally, and several states, just misidentifying yourself on the phone is a crime. It's a misdemeanor. Okay, so if you have that on day one, and then the next week you have trespassing, according to me, I know I'm not your judge, but according to me, Judge Dana, you now have stalking. You have 2 or more behaviors that would cause a reasonable person to feel fear or distress. This person's, watching me, and they're showing up on my property, and they're calling me and pretending to be someone else. Wow, scary, right? But if you didn't document or charge that telecommunications harassment or that voyeurism, now this trespassing is the first thing. Now we don't have a stalking case because we're starting from 1 instead of 2. And so even if it seems like a relatively minor thing, and sometimes we find that victims say, they kept saying they couldn't do anything until somebody hurt me. That's not true. There are plenty of nonviolent crimes that are still crimes. So let's certainly document all of that, report all of that, and when possible, charge all of that, because you're helping build up that course of conduct. You're building that stalking case down the line. And this, of course, is not an exhaustive list, but there are so many behaviors that can be part of it. We want to think creatively and broadly about accountability as much as possible. So some of the most common stalking behaviors is that unwanted contact, spreading rumors, following or spying. You could see them here. And most stalkers are engaging in more than one kind of behavior, right? And so they're not just showing up, they're not just contacting, they're using more than one means of approach, about 80%. About 2/3 of stalkers pursue their victims at least once a week. Many pursue daily. And the average duration of a stalking case, this really shocked me when I learned this, not the high end, the average duration of a stalking case is 2 years. And 10% of cases last 5 years or more. And so stalkers have plenty of time to start with one thing. Maybe they're sending a bunch of text messages and then they backed off, and we think, okay, great. But now they're showing up. Now we're getting weird gifts. Now other things are happening. And so, a stalker is going to change their behavior in response to how the victim reacts or doesn't react. And it can be a real no-win situation for victims, absolutely. But for us as victim service providers, we need to be thinking not only about what's already happened, but what might happen next. And of course, no, we can't read the future. We don't know exactly what an offender might do. But again, we tend to be incident-based. Okay, there's property damage. Let's report that. Let's charge that. Let's protect your property. Well, this offender is probably not going to stop with that. So what you want to do is think about all those different behaviors, the surveillance, life invasion, intimidation, interference, and say, what else might this offender do? If you do this, how do you think the offender might react? And try to be as preventative and forward-facing as possible in terms of anticipating that behavior and acting in the best interest of the victim. A couple co-victimizations here, and some of them have already come up, but just to highlight them a little bit more deeply. So stalking, like I said, it already has that intersection with intimate partner violence, and that about half of cases are current or former intimate partners are the offenders. Right. And we have a separate webinar on our website just on intimate partner stalking as well, if you want a deeper dive on that. But I want to bring us to our friend, the power and control wheel, which my guess is a lot of you have seen before. And so if you think about types of intimate partner violence, basically what this is illustrating, as many of you know, is that it's not just physical violence, right? There are many types of ways that someone can exert power and control. And so a lot of times in our field, when I hear someone talk about stalking, they'll talk about it the following way. They'll say something like, it was an abusive relationship, and then the victim left, then the offender began stalking that victim. And that can happen, absolutely. But let's take a step back. If during the relationship, the offender is showing up, put a GPS on the car, calling all the time, contacting the friends and coworkers, showing up at work, showing up at the apartment, that's stalking. Right? It's domestic violence. It's what we might call digital abuse or emotional abuse, and it's stalking. It's both. It can happen before, during, and or after a relationship. Sometimes it only starts after the relationship, but about half the time it's happening during the relationship as well, where it's a co-victimization. It's stalking and intimate partner violence. And this gets missed a lot, and that's a problem because while all stalkers can be dangerous, absolutely, on average, our intimate partner stalkers pose the greatest threats to their victims. They're the most likely to physically approach, be interfering, insulting, and threatening, use weapons to threaten or harm, have their behaviors escalate quickly, And while the recidivism rate is high across the board for stalkers, it's even higher for these intimate partner offenders. Another study reinforcing this was a study of women with protective orders. So all of them have been abused. All of them had a protective order. Some of them had been abused and stalked. For the women abused and stalked, they experienced higher rates of all of these harms listed here. Everything from verbal abuse and degradation to serious threats, moderate physical violence, severe physical violence, sexual assault, threats to kill or with a weapon, being beat up, attack with a weapon, and injury. Again, significantly higher rates across the board when abused and stalked. Now, I'm not saying that stalking is increasing the risk. What I am saying is that stalking is an indicator. It's a red flag. And when you see stalking within an intimate partner violence relationship, whether it's during or after, that should be a big indicator that, hey, this might be an especially high risk case. This offender might be especially dangerous, and it should really stick out. If we just call it emotional abuse or digital abuse, we might lose that sense of urgency, right? We lose that sense of, hey, we need to plan around this and kind of activate our stalking thinking a little bit differently. And again, the femicide risk, in the vast majority of intimate partner femicides, there is stalking the year prior. Another study showing this, threefold risk in intimate partner homicide when there's perpetrated stalking. And so again, we don't want to miss the stalking behavior or have it be kind of conflated with some of these, not conflated with, but kind of buried under these other things. Stalking and sexual violence, there's also quite a few intersections. The stalker might threaten or plan to sexually assault the victim. So perhaps their threats and intimidation or their contact has a sexual tinge to it, right? They might use sexual language or make sexual threats. They might actually be planning to sexually assault the victim. So that's why they're stalking. They're trying to gauge, when is this person vulnerable? When are they alone? When can I access them? And so they're watching that person in order to commit sexual assault or a similar crime. And so that can be an intersection. They might try to get someone else to commit the assault. So like that Grindr example I talked about earlier, where someone's sending third parties to assault the victim. They might actually assault the victim. That might be one crime in their course of conduct that happens at any point along there. Or sometimes the stalking actually begins with the sexual violence, and then there's contact after, either to say you better not tell anyone and intimidate the person out of reporting, or to say thanks for a great time, come back again next week, or some conflation of the two. We see that stalking actually starting after the sexual violence to continue that trauma, for that victim. And another here, if we're looking at intimate partner, and most of our research on stalking comes from intimate partner research. And so we don't always have like a statistic ready to go for overall. A lot of them come from intimate partner. For intimate partners who were stalked, almost a third of them are also sexually assaulted by that partner. And so again, these co-victimizations, that when someone's experiencing one, they may be experiencing the other. And so certainly if you're working with victims who are primarily presenting as sexual assault victims or domestic violence victims, make sure you're also asking them about those stalking behaviors, right? Make sure you also ask about those, because that's going to help you better safety plan for that victim and better hold that offender accountable for all the things that they're doing. So I know I keep being like, call it stalking, you got to call it stalking. Here's what stalking is. And you might be like, okay, I get that you want me to call it stalking because you're like the stalking lady. Why do I care? I'm doing this great work with victims and survivors. Does it matter what I call it? And unsurprisingly, I will argue, yes, it does, for these reasons, some of which I've already mentioned briefly. One of those charging and prosecution options, most prosecutors like having a menu of charges. And so having this as an option is great. Also, again, stalking is typically a higher charge than harassment. And also stalking is a great charge when prosecutors use it, would understand it. And I'll tell you why. Because if you're charging, let's say you're prosecuting domestic violence, the court's going to try to limit your case to that like 10 minutes of the, the alleged dispute or whatever. If you're charging stalking, you can bring in the entire course of conduct and paint a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender really is. And so those disturbing details that I shared with you, that, carve the name in the trees, the cup of coffee in the car, the send you roses the day I kill you, haunts me, haunts you, haunts judges and juries as well. And again, paints a much fuller picture of just how terrible this offender really is, in addition to this, potential incident of violence or sexual violence. And so it can be very strategic in that way as well. So it's a good one to use. Safety planning, again, stalking has its own risk profile. And it indicates a higher risk for our intimate partner violence victims as well. So if we miss that, then we miss the opportunity to really activate our thinking about stalking and safety planning, and to plan and to treat this with the appropriate level of urgency that it needs. And last but not least, victim empowerment. Even if a victim's saying, hey, I'm not gonna do any of that. Like, I'm not gonna report this to police. I don't wanna charge anything. I don't wanna change anything. Even just to be able to articulate, instead of my ex has gotten weird or my neighbor's being creepy, to say, I'm experiencing stalking. And that's a real thing. And I can Google it, and there's resources available, and other people experience this. Even that can go a really long way. Of course, I hear the word stalking all the time, but often used incorrectly. And I'm trying not to read the chat too much because it can be distracting, but I think someone already mentioned this up here, that, you know, we see this, the casual use. So you might have heard or said something like this. Like, I was totally Facebook stalking you, or I was stalking you on Insta, I was stalking you on Snapchat, I saw you went to Mexico, I guess this is 2019, I saw you went to the grocery store, it looked awesome, right? So assuming these folks in this picture are friends who are also friends on Facebook, does this sound like actual stalking? No, right? Because it's not scary or distressing. It's not scary that if you post a picture of yourself on a social media network, that your friends on that network see it, right? That's like why you posted it. But I hear this misused all the time. You know, people will say, and it's a bit unique to this crime, I would argue, with stalking. You know, no one says, oh man, that party's so lit, it was arson, right? That's not a thing. If you say there was arson, your friend's gonna be like, oh man, you gotta report that to the police, that's arson. But with stalking, you get this like, okay, but was it stalking or was it stalking kind of response? And it impacts how we respond as our official responders, as well as those informal networks. We know that when most victims talk to somebody about what they're experiencing, they don't start with victim service providers or law enforcement. They start with a friend or family member. Does that person say, hey, that sounds like stalking, which is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous, let's get you to some appropriate help? Or do they say, okay, but like, is it stalking though? Because if it's the latter, that can really minimize and discourage that victim from seeking help. So I'm not saying the casual use of this term causes stalking, but it does minimize and kind of influence our understanding of it, both as informal and formal responders. We also see it normalized in the media quite a bit. I think someone mentioned that as well. Really everything from our romantic comedies, where we have our, you know, usually male protagonist is trying again and again and again until they wear somebody down. But it's not just in our romantic comedies. It's a common trope in like our cartoons and sitcoms as well, with that, oh, there they are again. You know, you're like, SpongeBob will not respect Squidward's boundaries, right? Just showing up again and again, and it's played for laughs. There's no consequences. We have it in our superhero movies where, you know, Spider-Man's got to watch over the city and protect Mary Jane, right? So he's got to always have his eyes on her because he knows what's best. And so really across genres, we see these behaviors played off as either romantic or funny or just harmless or sexy or whatever, when in fact they are criminal, traumatic, and dangerous. And this can influence how we view these behaviors, how victims view these behaviors, and how these informal support networks, their friends and family, view it. So just something to be mindful of and critical of. So a few big picture strategies for responding to victims. One thing is we have to realize that victims respond to stalking in different ways. All of these are valid human reactions, so I'm not putting a value judgment on any of these, but some of these may be more or less effective in terms of dealing with a stalker. So I want to highlight both of those facts. So again, these are all normal reactions. So you might have some victims who really move against the stalker, who, okay, you're spreading rumors about me, I'm spreading rumors about you. Or, okay, there's nothing I want more than to bring you to jail, my friend. So now that you've done this, I'm going to get really involved and I will move against you and I will make this happen, right? We have some victims who that's their reaction. We have others do the opposite. I don't want to be a burden. I don't want to bother anyone. I don't want to put anyone at risk. And so they move very much inward, you know, and kind of isolate and really just kind of take that on themselves. You have others move away. So that's why we see so many stalking victims literally relocate, right? But move away could also be things like they block the offender on social media. They change their phone number. They stop going to that bar. They go to this new one instead. They drive to the farther away grocery store, right? They're trying to create distance. We have others who do the opposite, who move towards that offender, right? So, okay, they want a picture of me every day. I'll send them one once a week. trying to kind of appease them. And then you have some victims who move outward. That's what we want, for victims to, reach out to victim services, to criminal justice. But by the time they've done that, they've probably already tried some of these other things, right? And so you want to ask them what they've already done so you can meet them where they are, and also recognize that some of these, again, may be more or less helpful. And so one piece of advice I often hear given to victims that's well-intentioned but not always all that helpful is in this move away category, where folks will say, okay, they're texting you, like, block them. They keep calling you, change your number. They're contacting you on Snapchat, get off Snapchat, right? But let's play that out for a second. Again, if I'm stalking somebody and I keep calling and eventually they're like, I'm so over Dana calling me, I'm going to change my number. So eventually I, the stalker, get that number that's like, oh, this number is no longer in service. Am I going to be like, oh man, I guess I'll stop stalking and become a productive member of society this day? Like, no, what am I going to do? First of all, I'm definitely finding their new number. And also, I'm stalking them. So I know their email, I know where they work, I know where they live. I'm going to find another way around that. And I might be angry because that was my favorite way of stalking them and they took it away from me. So I might actually escalate my behavior. And multiple studies show this, that moving away from the stalker probably will not stop the stalking and might actually escalate the behavior. Now, this is not to say that victims should never distance themselves from a stalker. For many victims, that's exactly what they want to do, and that might be absolutely in their best interest. And so I'm not saying this is an always or never piece of advice, but it's not this obvious low-hanging fruit it's sometimes touted as. And if victims haven't, say, changed their number, that doesn't illustrate that they're not really afraid. It might illustrate that they know that that's not going to do anything, and they're probably right. Now, from a criminal justice perspective, of course, it's helpful to know what they've done because it helps illustrate that fear and that resistance and persistence, right? So if you block them on Facebook, they found you on Snapchat, you got off Snapchat, now they're emailing you. Okay, that's really helpful evidence in terms of your stalking case that this is a very persistent offender and that they should know that the victim doesn't want to hear from them. And so that was helpful, right? But again, from a victim safety perspective, maybe, maybe not. One helpful piece of move away advice that I hear is to cease contact with the offender. And generally that is advisable because offenders see any contact as a win, right? And so, if the offender calls 100 times and the victim picks up and says, I hate you, don't call me, tomorrow they're calling 101 times because that was a win for that offender. That being said, that is not always possible or realistic, and we do see victims moving towards the offender in the interest of their own safety. And so you might be thinking, well, why? So we had a case where it came out in court, it was being prosecuted, where the victim had called the offender at like 2 a.m. They talked for 3 hours. And so the defense is saying, well, how scared can she be? If she's so scared, why would she call him, right? So we asked the victim said, yeah, because I knew he got off work at the bar at 2 a.m. So I could hear him get in his car, drive home and fall asleep. I knew he wouldn't come over, break my windows and wake my kids up again. So sometimes it's that keep your enemies closer and take the temperature of the situation that's really in the best interest of that victim. And so that moving towards behavior is sometimes very protective. And so you want to do both, advise disengagement and recognize that's not always possible. If there's any hard and fast rules about that in your jurisdiction, like say they're going to lose the protective order if they reach out to the offender, okay, make sure a victim knows that, but keep the dialogue open. It's not like a bad thing the victim did to keep a secret from you, right? Something you want to safety plan around and have open dialogue about. And I just hope that I see more open-mindedness about that, because I've seen plenty of cases thrown out when it's like discovered that the victim reached out to the offender, even though there might be some very good practical reasons that they had to do that. In addition to that disengagement, we also want to document everything, right? And I mentioned that a few times. A lot of times we tell victims to document, but we don't tell them how. So they end up with like, it was a sunny day in Washington. And we're like, oh no, I'm not going to read this diary, right? And so something like this can be really, really helpful. Just a very succinct incident log. So date, time, what happened, where did it happen? A lot of jurisdictional issues in stalking cases, right? Because if there's, say, a student on campus and then something happens off campus and then they go visit their parents a state away, where did the stalking take place? And so that coordination within a department doesn't always happen, and across jurisdictions happens even less. So that can be really tough. If there are witnesses, name and contact information. If there were police reports, who they talk to. And that's not to get the officer in trouble or anything. It's just to help connect the dots, because there might be a different responding officer every time. So if this officer does no idea who this person is, and there's a cup of coffee in my car, you know, they're not going to see that sense of urgency, but being able to back it up with all this documentation can be really helpful. And you know, the truth is that these incidents add up, but they only add up if we do the math, right? And something like this can really help us to do that, to quickly and succinctly show everything that's going on. There's also a risk assessment specific to the crime of stalking and harassment, actually. So it's great, it's free, it's online. It's by that same researcher who developed that SLI framework, that surveillance life invasion. We have a webinar of us going through it with the sample case. If you want to see it, you can test it out before you're sitting across from a victim. Very helpful. It's too long for your like responding officer, but it takes about 15 minutes otherwise. Anyone can do this, law enforcement, the victim themselves, victim services. And what it does is create a succinct narrative report and a risk profile. It'll say, okay, there's these 14 risk factors. Based on what you shared, we have a low, medium, high risk, and here's what factors are, and here's some advice. It also creates some safety planning suggestions. This doesn't replace that individualized planning with the victim advocate, but it can be a good place to start. So really cannot recommend it highly enough. If you're saying, okay, something's going on here, but I don't know how risky it is it stalking, is it harassment, are they overreacting, are they underreacting, I don't know, this can help you untangle that, because we always say, ask the right questions. Well, what are they? They're in this assessment. So highly recommend. Of course, what we need most of all is much easier said than done, which is that coordination, which is why I'm so happy to see there are multidisciplinary professionals on the call today, because what we see so often in our stalking cases is really a system failure. And it's usually not like, oh, if this one person had made this one phone call, this would have been fine. It's really about the system. It's that our system is set up, again, to be incident-based. It's not set up for contextual, multi-jurisdictional, long-lasting crime, multi-incident crime that is stalking. And what I see over and over again is a lack of urgency. A lack of urgency with stalking cases, where it's just not seen as dangerous, but it really is. And we need people across the board to really understand this and to do this kind of advocacy. We need our public awareness educators to be letting people know about stalking, so that when they identify it in their own lives, so that when a friend talks to them, they respond with the appropriate level of urgency and get them to victim services. We need our victim service providers to identify it as a unique victimization and safety plan appropriately around it. We need our law enforcement to charge it. We need our prosecutors to pick up those charges and argue it effectively. We need our courts to have appropriate sentencing. We need our probation, parole, and corrections folks to continue to keep those victims safe and hold those offenders accountable. When any of that doesn't happen, we lose victims. And you don't want that happening in your location or anywhere. And there's no one whose job it is to do this. So it kind of has to be you, in whatever role that you play, saying, you know what, a lot of people don't know a lot about stalking, but I know that it is criminal, traumatic, and dangerous, that this is urgent, that I need to do some education here, and that I need to get people on the same page as much as possible and responding with the appropriate level of urgency to this crime. So a couple of resources to help you do so, and then I'll stick around for folks who have questions. Getting these like, I feel like I accidentally drew, I don't know, are you guys seeing these yellow lines? I don't know what happened there, okay. A couple resources. Spark is a project of Equitas, which is the prosecutor's resource for violence against women. So if you're a prosecutor, working with prosecutors, want training on admitting digital evidence, deeper dives in that, definitely reach out. Free 24/7 technical assistance funded by the Office on Violence Against Women. For stalking through technology, the National Network to End Domestic Violence is a great app called the Tech Safety app, and their safety net team has a lot of great information about the uses of technology for crimes, including stalking. So really helpful information about privacy settings, password safety, how can this be misused, etc. So just a really good source of information. There's no national stalking hotline. The closest thing we have is Victim Connect, run out of the National Center for Victims of Crime. And so if you are sharing the RAIN hotline, the DV hotline, make sure you also share Victim Connect for your stalking victims. They're going to refer to local victim service providers, usually rape crisis or domestic violence, even if the stalking is not related to that. So make sure you let your victims know that. If you're referring them, that yes, it's a neighbor and the best place is the rape crisis shelter, for example. Stalking Awareness Month is in January. I know you're already getting pumped, only 4 months away. We house those resources on our website. So, you know, if you're making some noise for Domestic Violence Awareness Month and Sexual Assault Awareness Month, which I hope you are, make sure you're making just as much noise for National Stalking Awareness Month. We have, you know, we'll have webinars, but also just easy to share social media materials. We have things that you can order like print materials, etc. So definitely check that out and be involved. Speaking of print materials, these are free. You can order them for your community. So if you're handing victims something on what is domestic violence, make sure you have something on understanding stalking too, right? So these are, again, you can order these from us on our website. We also have these awareness posters. And of course, everyone's favorite website, you know what, you love it, stalkingawareness.org for your practitioner guides, training modules, victim resources, and webinars like this one. To request future training, you can also contact us there. We're funded to provide training to all OVW grantees and potential grantees. So that's pretty much all victim services, mental health, law enforcement, prosecutors. So if you're thinking, wow, I want to share this with everyone, but learn more, you can just go to our website and request a training. And again, please do follow us on social media. It can help you to sort of keep stalking top of your mind year round. Here's my contact information. I hope that you'll stay in touch. I want to thank you so much for your dedication, for all the great work you do on the ground, and for hopping on yet another webinar to listen to me talk about stalking. I know it's easy for me to sit here and say, do this, use this tool, think about this. You're the ones actually on the ground keeping victims safe and holding offenders accountable. Everything's easier said than done, and I totally understand that. So thank you so much for the work that you do. And please don't hesitate to reach out with any additional questions or if we can be a resource for you. So I hope that you will keep in touch. And with that, I know I'm a couple minutes over time, so I will conclude, but I'll stick around for questions. So